So the food politics is a topic that is sort of near and dear to my heart because in writing my book, I first thought that I was writing about science, and I quickly learned that really the actual evidence base in science has little to do with our actual nutrition policy and our understanding about nutrition, and that it was 90% politics. We should really just all study political science in order to understand nutrition policy. And then after I wrote my book, I came to live it personally. So I'm just going to take you on a brief tour of food politics. Food politics really began kind of as a concept with Marion Nestle, who's an NYU professor, and she wrote this book that was really a seminal book in which deeply influenced me, in which she really showed how, because she had been a dietary guideline committee member, which is the expert group that makes the US dietary guidelines in 2005, and she had come to see how industry influences guidelines. And so she wrote this book, and immediately it sort of opened my eyes to this idea that there is this whole role that industry plays in manipulating the science and manipulating the guidelines and manipulating the people and the agencies that publish the guidelines. And she came to really, in her book, she really thought the problem was the meat and dairy and egg industries that had most undermined good science. And that's why we failed to have good health in America. And this is largely because she, Marion Nestle, and pretty much all of the people who are reigning nutrition scientists believe in the hypothesis set forth by Ancel Keys, whom you all know, which was that saturated fat and cholesterol raise your blood cholesterol, and that is what is responsible for heart disease. And the foods that have saturated fat and cholesterol in them are animal foods, meat, dairy, and eggs. So it seemed to make sense that those industries were the culprits. If we could just get rid of those industries and get rid of their products, we would all be healthier. That is an idea that goes back to 1961 with Ancel Keys and the American Heart Association. And you see this thinking really continuing right up until today. So this is like the incredible news coverage that followed our 2015 dietary guidelines, where I think I read every single article that came out about those guidelines, and 95% of them blame the meat industry for the fact that we have obesity and diabetes in America, and this is every mainstream and non-mainstream publication saying the reason the dietary guidelines are failed is because the meat industry has somehow influenced them. In this case, it was because they, due to environmental sustainability reasons, wanted to remove meat as a healthy food from the guidelines, basically tell people not to eat meat at all. And the meat industry rightly responded and said, environmental considerations are not part of the nutrition guidelines. It can't be, but this is a panel of nutrition experts. Why are they taking on environmental science? We just want to know if what a healthy diet is, and then we could maybe later talk about the environmental considerations of that diet. So that's why they were able to keep meat in the dietary guidelines, and then Marion Nestle and Center for Science in the Public Interest and many others called foul and blamed those failed guidelines on the meat industry. Yes?
Let me pull this up. It's rubbing. Okay, try that.
Okay.
It's rubbing on there.
Okay. It's too much of my luxurious Drew Barrymore curls. Okay, so this argument about everything being the fault of the dietary guidelines is becoming difficult, or that it's all the fault of the meat and dairy industries, has become more difficult with this graph, which I'm sure many of you have seen, which just shows, and which Zoe also alluded to, is that the obesity epidemic, and there's a curve like this that starts shortly thereafter, or the diabetes epidemics, really began with the dietary guidelines. This is not an exaggerated graph. And so it becomes harder to say that the obesity epidemic is due to the fact that Americans don't follow the guidelines, unless that's actually the case. Well, let me just show you this slide, which shows you that what happened with the dietary guidelines was a massive macronutrient shift that took place in the American population and every other population around the world that then followed them, which is that we were told to eat a low-fat diet, fat went down, saturated fat went down, because we were avoiding meat, cheese, dairy, egg, and carbs went way up. Carbohydrates went way, way up. So have we followed the guidelines? This is a chart that's a little bit still in progress. This is actually food consumption. And you'll see, this is the latest data that's come out, which is why the chart is still in progress, but it shows food consumption in America between 1970 and 2014. And it shows you that Americans actually have done an amazingly good job of following the dietary guidelines. We eat more fresh vegetables, more fresh fruit. All those lines in blue are things that we've been told to eat more of, and we do eat more of them. We eat vastly more grains. We eat more, vastly more vegetable oils. Those are the polyunsaturated fats that we're told to eat more of. And this is true of anything you look at. We eat more nuts. We eat more fish. We eat anything that we eat vastly more chicken. Like 121% times more chicken than we did 30 years ago. And we've decreased consumption of everything that we were told to decrease. So we've done, red meat is down, beef is down, every kind of whole fat dairy is down, butter is down, animal fats generally are down. So this argument that we have failed to follow the guidelines really is not, it's not supported by the evidence. So therefore, the kind of traditional food politics, which blames meat, dairy, and eggs for our diseases, is totally contradicted by this evidence. This has led that sort of traditional food politics group to take on new boogeymen, some of which are accurate. I mean, they've expanded the industries that they blame to sugar, and this is, something that I think we would all agree with. And the soda companies, there's a big effort to try to rein in Coke and Pepsi. And also just this idea that manufactured food companies are making these delicious, delectable foods that there's some combination of fat, sugar, and salt that we just cannot resist. We go into a store and it's just impossible to resist those Doritos, so we have to eat them. I think that this, on the whole, these criticisms are fairly on target with what most of us would believe about that the evidence supports, but this is where they stop, and so they generally support. I'm talking about sort of the nutrition established, mainstream nutritionist dietitians. They support the USDA food pyramid, and they support a high carbohydrate diet. And so they support a diet that's high in whole grains, high in fruits and vegetables, much of which are high carb foods. And just to show you that they really are, that is a high carb diet. This is, the columns in blue are the 3 USDA recommended diets where they say we have a variety of diets in response to the criticism that they no longer they don't have a range of diets to choose from. They say, yes, we do have a range, here it is. And it's all high carb, low fat. We just give them different names. And the green column shows you, sorry, I don't know why there's some green that's dropped off there, but the green column shows you what Americans used to eat in 1965. We ate fewer than 40% carbohydrates, which is extraordinary. That would be considered a low carb diet. You could say the entire American population was on a low carb diet in 1965. And by the way, there's another column here in green that looks pretty much like this, which is the true Mediterranean diet. The Mediterranean diet that performs so well in clinical trials and that has actually been studied is a diet with more than 40% fat. So the famous PREDIMED study that's cited all over the world. So the USDA Mediterranean diet is not the real one that's actually been tested in clinical trials. So this is kind of the old food politics. They're hanging on to these ideas, low fat, high carbohydrate diet. If we could just keep reducing animal foods, and if we could just keep focusing on fruits and grains and vegetables, we could, and if you could exercise a little bit more, we could all recover our health. So enter the new food politics. This is the new thinking. I've just put, everybody I think here knows this is a really seminal article by Gary that came out in the New York Times Magazine. What if it's all been a big fat lie? His books, my book. I'm putting these up here because these are sort of the books that really hit the mainstream. My book was focused more on saturated fats and why they're not bad for health. But I could equally well put up a number of other books that have preceded and come after our books that are also truly important. You should take a screenshot of this. One of the things I want to mention is we all know that Dr. Atkins sold like more books than anybody ever in the diet world, but who do you think they sold the second largest amount of books up here? Any guesses? Protein Power by Michael Eads sold 4 million books. I think all the rest of us combined did not even come to a fraction of that. So, and there are many more books that are not up here that should be up here. But the thinking really on this is that the food pyramid, our thinking is really it's not a matter of tweaking the food pyramid, but the food pyramid really has to be turned upside down. And that's the kind of the radical thinking that you really have to put grains in the teeny tiny tip at the bottom, and vegetables and fruit, somewhere are part of that. And there are various versions of this, but that's the idea that we're talking about. It's a radical idea, but there is a vast amount of evidence that now supports this idea. There's more than Actually, this is a little out of date, this slide, but more than 70 randomized controlled clinical trials on altogether thousands of people, 3 of them lasting at least 2 years, which is supposed to be long enough to see if there are any kind of side effects that might turn up, and none did. And they have all established that low-carb diets are not only safe, so therefore not a fad, dangerous diet, which is what the sort of the general conception is, but they are also highly effective for treating every kind of chronic nutrition-related disease that we know. So this, we all think, I wish I knew how to put music in my PowerPoint presentation. Like, shouldn't this be the Holy Grail? Here we have a solution. This works. Why are we not accepted with open arms? So this is sort of the story of the new food politics that we've now encountered, which is we're not welcome with open arms. And the very basic reason is that if low carb is right, low fat must be wrong, right? They're just diametrically opposite. There's sort of the people who wish that they could have, straddle all diet. And it's true that there's a range of diets. Then some people do very well, especially healthy people do well on higher carbohydrate diets. They're fine. But for people who are sick and have metabolic conditions, the low carb diet clearly works much better. But it's just diametrically opposed to low fat. There's one sort of well-known MD who has been trying to straddle both the low fat and the low carb worlds, being with all his colleagues in low fat and low carb. It's incredibly acrimonious because they're all really basically at war with each other. And I wrote him an email and said, well, how's that straddling going? And he said, I'm getting awfully bow-legged. So it doesn't really work. I mean, the low-fat world knows that we are, a dagger aimed at the very heart of what they've been preaching. So I want to explain a little bit what are the forces behind resistance to change. One is that there's this tremendous institutional investment in the low-fat, high-carb diet. This has, been the official diet of the United States since 1980, and the American Heart Association since 1961. All these groups. And many, many others, all medical professional associations, they've all been giving this advice. And most of the media has been giving this advice. So there's this tremendous institutional investment. There's also a huge amount of just cognitive dissonance. I think, I'm putting down the universities that have provided the science that underpins our dietary guidelines, and this is certainly not all of them, it's just some of the ones that are more prominent. But I think we've all encountered this cognitive dissonance. If I'm wrong, that means my entire career has been wrong. It means I've been doing the wrong thing. I've been writing the wrong thing. So there's just a lot of cognitive dissonance to change. There's also massive industrial forces that support the low-fat diet. Big pharma, in many ways, in the obvious way, which is that they make their money from people being sick. They sell them drugs and insulin, and so they have a tremendous investment in people being sick. They also understand that the whole statin industry knows that they depend on the low-fat diet because the statin industry has been predicated upon lowering your LDL cholesterol. that low-fat diet also lowers your LDL cholesterol. If we start to ignore LDL cholesterol because it turns out to not track very well with heart attacks, actually, and we start to focus on other risk factors like HDL and triglycerides and any host of LDL density or particle number, those look much, much better on a high-fat diet. So the whole statin industry is behind preserving the low-fat diet, which depends upon relying on LDL cholesterol. And if you go to recently, Sarah Hallberg, who's an MD, she went to the American Diabetes Association. She said at that association, this is typical of all medical associations, they're completely supported by all the big pharma companies. She said there was not one bit of information on the low-carb diet. The entire place was filled with all kinds of advertisements about different kinds of therapies and different kinds of drugs. There's now a device that it's like medical bulimia. It's like a bag that you hang outside of your body permanently to sort of collect food so it doesn't go into your digestive system. And actually 45 organizations around the world, mostly Diabetes Association, just adopted gastric bypass as the first course of treatment for people with diabetes. So instead of going on a low-carb diet first and seeing if that works, you should instead get $26,000 surgery with many potentially dangerous side effects. But of course, as we all know, doctors don't make much more money off of surgery than they do counseling diet. So that's big pharma. Big food. We all know big food is, if you look at supermarket aisles, cookies, crackers, chips, breads, 80% of what's in a supermarket is all grains, vegetable oils, and sugar. That's pretty much what all these foods are made of. So they depend on a high grain diet. If they can say whole grain on it, then it's healthy. So get your whole grain chips in your oatmeal. And they also sponsor like the pharmaceutical companies, they also sponsor all of the medical associations. And many of them directly sponsor the nutrition science, as does Big Pharma, directly studies nutrition scientists. Actually, one of the amazing things that I came across when I started researching food scientists, nutrition scientists, was that they all took money from pharma companies. And I was like, you're studying food, why do you take money from Big Pharma? But of course, Big Pharma understands that if you can support a unhealthy diet, then they'll profit from that. And some companies are even perfectly vertically integrated in making you sick and then profit off your sickness. Quite a few companies are involved in this, like Nestle, which came to fame by selling sweetened formula. That's how formula with sugar. That's how they started their company, and now they have a bunch of sort of healthy products that help you once you are obese and diabetic from their products. We're like the barbarians at the gate, taking aim at the dietary guidelines, and what are the tactics that are used against us? Because it really is a serious confrontation, and so I want to tell you some of what those are, because they're not always transparent to people when you read the media. One of them is to portray the science as settled. There is an enormous effort to say, we all agree that a low-fat, high-grain diet, or as they now call plant-based diet, is best, and we all agree on that. And there should be no question about that, which is, of course, antithetical to science. Science should invite debate, dispute, discussion. But this is part of, so there was a whole kind of consensus conference that included scientists from Harvard and Yale, and they all came out with this consensus statement. We know what is right, and stop challenging us. So that's one tactic that is used. The other is personal attacks, which I'm sure many of you have suffered. My particular favorite is being called an animal by Dr. David Katz. But you see this everywhere. There's just ad hominem attacks against people who are taking on the conventional wisdom, and it's just one way of not dealing with the science. It's just going after people personally. I want to note that this is not something that is unique to our times. This is something that Ansel Keys actually pioneered. He and his colleagues, what I call the blood sport of nutrition science, where he, when he was criticized by a prominent professor in an article in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 1973, and somebody who just criticized not him, his hypothesis, went over the evidence about whether or not saturated fat actually causes heart disease, and he replied in a 28-page reply. I mean, normally you're given like a letter to the editor, right? 400 words. Ansel Keys, just to show you his prominence in the field, he was allowed to reply in 28 pages, during which time he just resorted to all kinds of really nasty comments. Reiser's analysis reminds one of the distorting mirrors in the Hall of Jokes at a county fair. He pompously states, he obviously has no comprehension. After this came out, Reiser wrote a short letter of reply where he said, I feel like I must reply just to counter the response that I have deliberately lied in my work. And you see this throughout, actually, from the 1960s on, which is sort of nutrition scientists really defending themselves by making personal attacks on the opposition. Another one, I'm very happy that Zoe talked about the Tim Noakes trial, because this effort to really silence low-carb voices around the world, I mean, it's, Professor Noakes is one and probably the most prominent, but there was also the case of Jennifer Elliott in Australia, I think, who had her she had her nutritionist license taken away from her for counseling low carb, even though she'd been working as a health practitioner for 25 years. Gary Fettke, who's with us today in the audience, Tasmania. He is an orthopedic surgeon. Orthopedic surgeons are the people who cut off the limbs of diabetics when they have to have their limbs amputated. So he has many diabetic patients, and he started to realize that if he counseled them to eat less sugar, maybe there would be fewer amputations, and he could help them. And his local nutritionist, dietitians association, basically put a gag order on him and told him that he was not allowed to counsel people not to eat sugar. That he had, I can't remember the exact words, he had dangerously cured his patients of diabetes. And that's a lifetime gag order. I don't know if I'll ever be able to contest it. Karen Zinn, whom you saw, who was testified with us at the Noakes trial, she's also been counseled heavily, called into her dietitians association and told that she really has to watch it when it comes to counseling the low-carb diet. And there's some evidence to suggest that these kinds of attacks are coordinated. There are, the Nutritionists and Dietitians Association. There's clearly communications between them. There's an organization called ILSI, which is an industry group that is funded by Coke and Pepsi and Mars and all these, and they've been involved in funding and or at least supporting some of these efforts. So this is no joke. My own experience in trying to, be censored was that I was invited to be on a prominent panel. This is about a year ago, actually, where I was invited to be on this panel, something called the National Food Policy Conference in Washington, D.C. And I'll just tell you a little bit about this story because it's very funny. So I was called up by the organizer of this conference. It's a long time conference in Washington, D.C., and he calls me up, and it's his first year on the job. And I had sent him my book. I said, would you like to have some other voices in your conference? And it's in D.C., so all the policymakers are there to listen. And it's an important conference. And he said, the other people on the panel are Barbara Millen, who's the head of the dietary guidelines, and the USDA person, who's the head of the dietary guidelines, and CSPI, which is a group that defends the dietary guidelines. And I said, sure. Knowing that they all can't stand my work. And so we hung up the phone. He said, wonderful, I'll confirm. I'll just, we hung up the phone, and I went to my husband. I said to my husband, how long do you think it'll be until he calls back and says, oh, I'm sorry, I made a terrible mistake. And sure enough, 9 o'clock the next morning, there was a phone call from him saying, oh, I'm really sorry, but the other 3 panelists are threatening to resign, not participate if you're on the panel. So, I felt a little sorry for him. So I said, okay. And then our own Ivor Cummins, Fat Emperor, used the modern day emperor's technique and started a petition. And we got almost 4,500 signatures in a week. And that was all reported in local newspapers in DC, but I was not reinstated. But it's clearly an effort to prevent conversation about other points of view. Another tactic that is used and has been used for decades is to really try to silence the science. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of this because it is so striking. Literally, studies that come out that have contradictory results, in other words, they don't support the official guidelines, are denied, like they don't exist. And the most startling example of this is the Minnesota Coronary Survey, which some of you know, which was the largest ever test of Ancel Keys' hypothesis, where it was conducted in an inpatient setting in mental hospitals, so highly controlled. It went on for 4.5 years. At the end, it was NIH funded, and at the end of that, they found that but people who reduced their saturated fat had no benefit in cardiovascular mortality. It didn't save any deaths, and moreover, they died at higher rates from cancer and suicides, bizarrely. So that study wasn't published. It wasn't published for 16 years. And this is Ivan France, who is the chief investigator on that. Actually, later I found out that Ancel Keys was also one of the chief investigators on it, and they just simply didn't publish it, which is a form really of scientific fraud. You're supposed to publish your your work. And much later, when Gary Taubes interviewed Ivan France and said, why did you not publish your results? And he said, well, we were just so disappointed in the way they came out. So this is not a solitary case. And so we just haven't had the evidence. We've invested, the government, your taxpayer dollars are invested in hundreds of millions of dollars in doing studies that just haven't been given any attention. So that sort of leads to the next point about silent studies that are actually published, but then nobody ever talks about them. They literally are they're not included in reviews, they're barely discussed, they're just ignored. This was the Women's Health Initiative is a really amazing example of that, which was the largest ever clinical trial of the dietary guidelines that took place on almost 49,000 women over 8 years, all of whom ate a low-fat diet, at the end of which they could not find any benefit of the low-fat diet. No reduction in obesity, diabetes, any kind of cancer, or heart disease, nothing. And that was published in 2000. All those papers came out in 2006. Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about it at all. They weren't cited in the most recent dietary guidelines. Or if they were cited kind of in an incorrect way. This is just another small data point. It's not really the largest ever trial of the dietary guidelines. And then a third way is that journals that just simply refuse to publish results to the contrary. I think that I've talked to dozens and dozens of researchers who've tried to get their good trials published, and they just get rejected, and they cannot get them published. Another way that you suppress the science is to insist on retraction. And that's what happened to me. I published this article in the British Medical Journal that probably is about the most serious critique of the dietary guidelines. And 180 scientists were rounded up by Center for Science in the Public Interest, and they demanded retraction of that paper based on 11 alleged errors. That took a year to get through that process, and outside reviewers were consulted, and the British Medical Journal stood strongly by the paper, which was wonderful. But thank you. It was, I must say, a lot of lost sleep over that. But these kinds of efforts to retract or intimidate or silence people, they serve different they served two functions. One is that they literally suppress the science, so the science can't be heard and can't be seen. But they also send clear cautionary messages to anybody who might consider publishing or talking about alternative ideas on nutrition. So, how many people are going to step up after, Professor Noakes got the treatment that he did, or the treatment that I got? Or, people they see that, and it's a cautionary tale to them. So I think that that's one of the, that's one of the intentions of hitting those of us who are sticking our necks out so hard. I want to go back to this slide, sorry, but this is another tactic that is used to try to kind of just discredit those of us with different ideas, and that is always to say that you're motivated by a financial gain of some kind. Either you're on the payroll of the meat, egg, or dairy industry. I mean, I have to, so my full disclaimer, I don't receive any money for my research from any industry. And that if you've written books, that your books must be only written for financial gain. And this is also something that Keyes pioneered when he was confronted by Yudkin, who had a competing hypothesis to his own. Yudkin's hypothesis, as many of you know, was that sugar caused heart disease. And Keyes came after him really hard. And one of the tactics that he used was to say that Yudkin had financial backer, his commercial backers. Ironically, I don't know if how many of you have read Gary Taubes' new book, but it turns out that Ansel Keys was on the payroll of the sugar industry. So even our gold standard guidelines, and this was part of the evidence that we presented, that I presented at the Noakes trial, which is that they refuse to acknowledge the science on low carbohydrate diet. If you ignore it, then you don't have to consider it. And this was one of the things that came out in my that they said they looked for it, but they couldn't find it. A body of literature that includes more than 70 clinical trials, they said, well, we couldn't find it. Sorry. Now, the part of the new politics is that there is a tremendous, in addition to this kind of assault on science, there's now a whole number of other advocacy groups that are bringing kind of new energy to the mostly plant-based diet, and they come from the animal welfare movement. They come from the environmental movement that thinks that cows cause global warming and consume too many of the Earth's resources, and they come from a kind of social justice. We need to eat a mostly plants diet because then we can feed more people. There's more calories. We can produce more calories per acre of plants, and therefore we can feed more people. So, and these groups are all very, very united around this message. Is there any hope? What can you do? I think that it's not, I think that there is a kind of energy that comes from the bottom up in this area. So cure yourself, cure your loved people, your loved ones around you, take charge of your own life. Everybody, one of the great things about nutrition is that unlike environmental science, where none of us can say, we don't know what causes air pollution and we can't do our own studies, we can all do our N=1 study on our own body. So everybody has their own data point to work with, and that makes the kind of the grassroots movement very strong. And then the other thing to do is, there is this kind of budding effort for advocacy to change the dietary guidelines ultimately, so that there's the correct advice coming sort of from the top down. And this is important even for people who don't think it's important to them, because like in the United States, for instance, all the food that's served to the military and school lunches and programs for the elderly, in hospitals, all that food is pegged to the dietary guidelines. People who practice low carb are still vulnerable because the gold standard dietary guideline says that that's not a safe diet. So there's medical malpractice issues. Insurers don't want to, they're wary of it, so are medical practices. So what's dictated from the top down really matters. And so there's this group in the UK that Sam Feltham talked about this morning. In the US, we have the Nutrition Coalition. We're working on petitions for change and doctors groups to share ideas. And so I think that we will see change, hopefully in not too long. This is one of my favorite quotes, which is, we clearly need new people to rise and stand up and not be intimidated by the kinds of attacks that some of us has been getting, because we really need new people to, our problems are not going to be solved by the generations that have led us here for the last 40 years. So I urge you all to get involved. Thank you very much for listening to me.